Before you proceed with anything else occupying your attention at this moment, it becomes essential to pause, draw in a full breath, and channel your entire focus toward the present instant. Your arrival here wasn't accidental, nor was it driven by some random algorithm shuffle. Something stirs beneath the surface, an invisible current that has already begun its flow. You sense it as a subtle weight upon your chest, as a certainty that defies logical explanation. When the soul calls out, it doesn't request permission, it interrupts the person you believed yourself to be, just moments before you encountered these words, passing through an inner moment of overwhelming intensity. Even when it remains unspoken, even when it hides behind routines and silence, that sensation proves itself real. It manifests as restlessness, pressure, a lingering sense of something incomplete suspended in the air. This isn't ordinary nostalgia, nor a gentle memory. It represents something deep, uncomfortable, urgent calling, something that can no longer be suppressed without emotional consequences. Perhaps you wonder why, when what was experienced felt so genuine, silence stretched on for so long, leaving such a profound connection hanging in nothingness. The answer isn't simple, but it carries honesty. There exist resistances that persist only as long as the soul possesses energy to maintain them. If any of this resonates with you, consider following and leaving your thoughts below. I'm choosing myself. Small actions that allow this space and this truth to continue meeting with you. Jung explained how there comes a point when the psyche grows weary of fleeing from itself. He termed it the moment when the shadow awakens, that inner part which remembers what was real and faces everything. Separation often doesn't arise from a lack of affection, but from fear of feeling it. Yet the unconscious doesn't forget, it simply waits, and when it matures sufficiently, it demolishes whatever walls the ego has erected. For an extended period, this person attempted to convince themselves they could move forward without looking back. New patterns, new conversations, constant distractions. Nothing functioned. Every attempt only highlighted the emptiness left by your absence. Now an internal dialogue unfolds that doesn't quiet a gentle but firm urgency to speak what remained hidden. It's not an impulse, it's coherence, because there arrives a precise moment in time when the soul ceases resisting. It's not a matter of imagination or projected desire. Synchronicities occur that transcend logic, songs that appear without anyone searching for them, numbers that repeat with uncanny precision. The unconscious speaks in symbols when truth won't fit into words. This person can ignore them during daylight hours, but at night, when vigilance loosens, the message returns, and returns with greater clarity. If not heard in time, it comes back with greater intensity. Jung maintained that when something is authentic, it doesn't disintegrate, it transforms. On the visible plane there may be distance or silence, but in the invisible realm, the connection remains active. This person remembers minimal details that nobody else preserves, the way of looking a phrase uttered without intention, those things that seemed trivial. Now these memories carry more weight because they no longer compete with denial, they compete with truth. And truth, when it matures, always claims its space. Externally, things might appear calm, work, commitments, smiles, routines, but this balance is a functional mask. Inside, there's constant tension, a battle between moving forward and returning. The mind calculates reasons for abandonment. The soul responds with feelings, not arguments with discomfort. And this discomfort grows each time an attempt is made to envision a future where your energy isn't present. That's where the breaking point emerges. Realizing that continuing this way also hurts. This internal conflict exhausts, not because strength is lacking, but because there's too much resistance. Defending against feeling consumes more energy than passing through the pain. Jung observed this repeatedly. What's suppressed doesn't vanish, it intensifies, seeping into the body, into moods, into flawed decisions. That's why there's now sleeplessness, distraction, persistent unrest. The unconscious has already decided. All that remains is for consciousness to find the courage to accept what it always knew. Accepting doesn't mean rushing mindlessly toward you. It means stopping the flight from oneself. There's a fundamental difference in that. This person knows that staying silent longer isn't neutral. It's an internal betrayal. Each day of silence adds a layer of potential regret. It's not fear of rejection that weighs heavy. It's fear of not having been faithful to what was felt. And when this fear changes form, it becomes an impulse, a quiet but firm impulse. Perhaps that's why you appear now in the simplest moments, not in grand memories, but in everyday occurrences. Similar laughter, a shared place, an unfinished conversation that returns without warning. This isn't romanticism, it's a deep emotional association. The brain connects safety with genuine presence, and when this presence is missing, the entire system notices. No routine or distraction can mask this message for long. For years it was believed that silence protects, that distancing is the safest way to avoid being overwhelmed. But prolonged silence, when affection exists, becomes a burden, an open question that prevents sleep. Jung warned that the psyche, sooner or later, demands coherence. It doesn't accept living in fragments. When that arrives, life pushes from within not as punishment, but as necessary correction to restore integrity. Right now, an active internal dialogue proceeds, a voice that persists, that doesn't fall silent. It doesn't demand perfect expression or logical explanation. It asks for honesty, to say something, even if clumsily, to open the door, rather than let it rust completely shut. Because not everything that was lost happened due to lack of affection. Some things are lost because of excessive fear, and that fear no longer holds the same power as before. This is the threshold Jung spoke of, the point where resistance becomes unsustainable, where remaining the same costs more than changing. The soul is already weary of negotiating with itself. It no longer seeks control, ego searching for truth. And when that happens, movement is inevitable. It may be slow, it may be discreet, but it's real. Something reorganizes on the other side of silence. It prepares to say what it couldn't. This doesn't guarantee a specific outcome, it guarantees coherence. The approaching contact isn't born from lack, but from the need to be whole, to close with truth and not with escape. Jung stated it clearly. Only when we face what we feel do we stop being controlled by it. And that quiet but decisive moment is much closer than it seems. What forms isn't impulsive, it's a consequence. Every unexpressed emotion, accumulated pressure like water behind an invisible dam. From the outside, nobody notices, but inside the structure cracks. Jung explained that when psychic energy doesn't find conscious outlet, it seeks indirect paths. That's why there's now fatigue without cause, subtle irritability, melancholy that appears even on good days. The soul warns before it breaks. This person begins questioning past decisions with a different perspective, not from guilt, but from sincerity, asking whether they truly chose or merely reacted to fear. And this question isn't comfortable, because it means acknowledging that separation wasn't always freedom. Sometimes it was misunderstood protection. When this understanding appears, something releases. The defense loses rigidity. The old story no longer convinces, and the heart begins gaining ground. There exists a specific moment in the day when this intensifies. Usually it's in the quiet before sleep, after awakening on silent roads. There are no distractions there to dull things. Your memory appears with pure clarity, without drama. It doesn't hurt like before. It weighs differently. It weighs like an unspoken truth. And Jung would say that this is the unconscious pushing suppressed material into consciousness to be integrated, not denied. To integrate means accepting that something was real, even if it didn't turn out as expected. And this is difficult for the ego, because accepting the depth of the bond means accepting the loss and also the emotional responsibility. This person feels it. They know looking elsewhere no longer functions. Every attempt at rationalization proves insufficient. Logic explains, but doesn't soothe. Only internal coherence begins bringing incipient calm. That's why the impulse toward contact doesn't emerge from emptiness, but from excessive silence. It doesn't try to rewrite the entire story. It tries to release what was imprisoned, to say what remains suspended, not to be rescued or to rescue you, but to honor what was genuine. Jung identified this as the soul's most honest impulse. When it's denied avenues for too long, it breaks the structures rather than continue fragmenting. And right now, those structures are yielding. This person might appear outwardly unchanged, maintaining their usual activities, but internally, there's a reorganization in motion. The weight of what wasn't said has exceeded the fear of saying it. That's the tipping point. Not because courage arrived suddenly, but because resistance exhausted itself. Jung wrote that the psyche always moves toward wholeness, and when a meaningful experience remains incomplete, the energy returns repeatedly until it finds closure. Not from obsession, but from the need for balance. What comes isn't a dramatic plea for reconciliation. It's a simple act of internal honesty. Putting into words what existed, without embellishment or accusations, just raw recognition. You were important. That was authentic. And pretending otherwise is no longer sustainable. These aren't prepared phrases rehearsed to sound perfect. They're truths that have been ripening in silence until they could no longer be contained. Jung called this the moment when the psyche refuses to keep wearing masks, even comfortable ones. It demands alignment between what's felt and what's expressed. And when this demand becomes strong enough, it overrides every defense mechanism. This person knows there's no guarantee of how you'll respond. Perhaps you've moved on. Perhaps the door won't reopen. Perhaps this comes too late. But strangely, that uncertainty weighs less now, because the act itself, the act of being truthful, carries its own liberation. Jung understood this deeply. Healing doesn't always require external validation. Sometimes it simply requires internal congruence, saying what needs to be said, regardless of outcome. This transforms the relationship not necessarily with you, but with their own integrity, and that matters more than any specific response. You might notice subtle shifts in how this person carries themselves, a different quality in their energy, less burdened, more grounded, not because problems dissolved, but because they stopped avoiding the central truth. Jung observed that when we integrate shadow material, our rejected or suppressed parts, our entire being becomes more coherent. We stop wasting energy on internal conflicts, and that energy becomes available for authentic living. This approaching contact represents exactly that, a step toward integration, not to recreate the past, but to acknowledge it fully, to give it the space it deserves in the narrative of their life, rather than pretending it never mattered. This kind of honesty requires maturity. The ego wants guarantees, wants to know the outcome before acting, but the soul doesn't negotiate that way. It acts from inner necessity, trusting that alignment with truth is its own reward. Jung wrote that individuation, the process of becoming truly yourself, always involves facing uncomfortable truths. And this person is doing exactly that. They're choosing authenticity over comfort, truth over safety. That's why this moment carries such quiet power. It's not loud or dramatic, but it's profoundly transformative. When you receive whatever message comes, whether directly or through the universe's subtle signs, you'll be encountering someone who has done their internal work. Someone who isn't reaching out from neediness or manipulation, but from a place of centered honesty. Jung would recognize this as a sign of psychological health, the ability to feel deeply, to acknowledge that feeling, and to express it without attachment to outcome. This is emotional maturity in action. And whether this leads to reconnection or simply to honorable closure, both possibilities carry dignity. Because the goal isn't to possess you or to recreate what was. The goal is to be truthful, to say, I see you, I saw you, what we shared was real, and I honor that. That liberates more than any scripted resolution. The internal dialogue has shifted from should I to when will I speak with truth. Jung said the psyche doesn't tolerate long-term inconsistency. That's why there's now a peculiar calm before movement. It's not complete peace, it's alignment, as if all internal parts finally reached a silent agreement. The approaching contact doesn't seek to reopen wounds, but to close them with awareness. It isn't burdened with reproaches, it's burdened with authenticity. To say what was real, to acknowledge what was avoided. Jung insisted that only what is faced can transform, and now the emotion is ready to be seen without masks. This doesn't guarantee permanence, it guarantees integrity, which is much deeper. You might notice it before it happens, a feeling of calm, untroubled anticipation, as if something in the air is aligning. This isn't mystical intuition, it's subtle emotional reading. Two internal processes reaching their point of maturity. Jung spoke of synchronicity, when internal and external meet without forcing. This moment belongs to that logic. It doesn't push itself, it allows itself. This message, this word, this gesture, isn't born from the need to return, but from the need to be honest. And that difference changes everything. When action emerges from truth, it doesn't require results, it offers itself. Jung saw in this type of action a sign of advanced individuation, doing what's internally right, even when the external world is uncertain. That's genuine emotional strength. The contact may be brief, but its impact will be deep, because it liberates, because it organizes, because it returns energy to the system. Jung explained it clearly. What's consciously expressed stops operating from the shadow, and now the shadow has fulfilled its function, showing fatigue, revealing truth, pushing to the edge. What follows is light. Sober, unidealized. Not every reunion is meant to last. Some are for dignified closure, and that's also affection, self-affection, conscious affection. This person understands that. They no longer seek to be rescued, nor to rescue. They seek fidelity to what was felt. Jung considered this point a psychological milestone. When we stop living from fear and start living from internal coherence, the story changes its tone. There's no rush, there's presence. There are no promises, there's truth. To say what was, to accept what couldn't be, to honor what existed. That liberates more than any artificial happy ending. Jung never promised comfort, he promised meaning. And meaning is born when we're capable of viewing our story without denial or idealization. If this message resonated within you, it's not coincidence. You're witnessing the closing of an internal cycle. And genuine closures don't always make noise, but they always leave space. Space for something more authentic. Jung left this as legacy. What we face transforms us. What we avoid controls us. Someone has decided to stop being controlled by silence. This is the point where resistance ends, where the soul no longer negotiates, where speaking truth weighs less than concealing it. Jung described this as the moment when the authentic self takes the helm. There's no return when that happens, because what's decided from depth doesn't get revoked. It gets honored, even when it hurts, even when it's not perfect. And here remains the final declaration, not as a call, but as accepted identity. I won't surrender. I choose myself. This is what happens when the soul stops resisting, when truth becomes action. When, as Carl Jung taught, internal integrity has greater value than anything maintained by fear. If this reflection accompanied you this far, consider following and leaving a comment. Things become clearer when we pursue them together.